Hello and welcome. Finally a new video. It's been a while, but I've been working on this one and finally at the point where I have enough information and enough benchmarks to make it worthwhile. So welcome to the 3DFX Voodoo 3 shootout. This video is going to look at a range of different Voodoo 3 benchmarks. And perfect time for GPU June 4. So I did partake in GPU June 1 and 2. I think I gave 3 a skip, but back for GPU June 4. So what's this video about and what are we doing? Well, let's have a look at all these cards. I have a huge 3DFX collection and I have been wanting to benchmark the differences between the Voodoo 3s. Now there's actually quite a lot of different variations of the cards, and so I wanted to get as many together as possible and benchmark them. Now I've got pretty much every single Voodoo 3 that I could find, and if there's anything missing, please let me know. The only one that I own that is not being benchmarked today is I've got a MSI motherboard with an integrated Voodoo 3. Unfortunately, that one, the capacitors are pretty crusty and I haven't replaced them, and it's just in a post loop. I'm not actually sure if it is the capacitors, but that motherboard has a very known set of issues. So let's take a look at what cards we're looking at. So the first one is the Velocity 100. This is the lowest end 3DFX Voodoo chip. It's got 8 meg of RAM, so that's the most unique part of this video card. Every other 3DFX card usually has 16 meg. So it's got 16 meg of RAM, 8 meg of RAM and SGRAM. So SGRAM can be a little bit faster. So this one I'm definitely interested in looking at, and I think this one's going to be one of the more interesting ones. It also by default has the second TMU disabled. So that's quite different from the other Voodoo cards. As you can see here, this is quite a sort of bare bones looking card, and runs a bit cooler as it's only running at the 143 megahertz. So that's the first one for the benchmark. Now the next one is the Voodoo 3 1000. So this one sometimes gets a bit confused with the Velocity 100. I think some cards actually called this the Velocity 100. This is actually, from everything I've read, is a Voodoo 3 1000. And this one's interesting. It's using SGRAM, and so that will play into some of the benchmarks we look at. But primarily it's running the same 16 megabytes of RAM as your normal Voodoo 3 2000 or 3000. But the core is only clocked at 125 megahertz. So this one, as you can see, is running without even a heatsink. To be honest, I'd be a bit nervous to run this unless you had some fans running over it. But quite a nice looking card. And yeah, so pretty much exactly the same other than the SGRAM, and it has no heatsink on it. So if you put a heatsink on it, you could probably overclock this quite well. Not looking at overclocking in this video because I've already got so many benchmarks. But this one is, other than the 125 megahertz core and memory, it is basically the same as the other Voodoo cards out there. So the next one is the Voodoo 3 2016 meg PCI. Now this one is one of my favorite cards, simply because it's one of the first 3DFX cards I got. It runs quite hot, but it has always been very reliable. So I've got quite a few of these, and these are pretty popular, and being PCI, very useful to use in, for example, a AMD K62 or Pentium without AGP. So really nice card. Again, they do run really hot, so I recommend getting a fan blowing over it. Now you can see that they do actually have on the back of the PCBs, they usually have the age of them. Can be a bit hard to see, but they usually have the year and the week listed on them. So yeah, this one I've had for a long time and quite a nice card. All right, the next one. This one, the Voodoo 3 2000 LC 16 meg PCI. I'm calling it the LC because that's what the BIOS says. My understanding is this one's actually from an OEM. It may have been like an arcade kind of machine or an OEM. I'm not quite sure. But you can have a look here and see that it is got a couple of missing memory chips. So I'm not quite sure why. It must be running higher capacity RAM. It is 16 megabytes. And it has SGRAM. So it's the same as the Voodoo 3 2000, but it has SGRAM. So nominally it should be slightly faster. But quite a nice card. I picked this up with the Velocity 100 and the Voodoo 3 1000 in a bulk buy probably 15 years ago for quite cheap. And this one works well. So this will be useful to benchmark the difference between the SG and SDRAM on the cards. So yeah, quite a nice card, this one. I quite like this card. All right, next one. This one will probably be a lot of people the most common card out there, the Voodoo 3 2000 AGP. Now this one's really interesting because I had every other card except this one. I had to actually buy this card for the video. I suppose most cards, at least in Australia, they were either the Voodoo 3 2000 PCI or the Voodoo 3 3000 AGP. I suspect those were the two most common cards out there. So if you, I assume the price difference wasn't huge. And so the only difference between the 2000 and the 3000 is the increase in core clock from 143 to 166. So this is the 2000, but again, this will be great for our PCI versus AGP benchmarks. So yeah, again, quite a nice card. The layout's a little bit different to the PCI one, but otherwise it's pretty similar, and had no issues running it. So a nice little card, this one. All right, and the next card is the Voodoo 3 3000 PCI. This one's probably my second most recent card. It was a bit hard to find. Never had one. Again, I think usually a 2000 would be the most common card to have. But again, you can see really nice card. It's got a slightly bigger heatsink than the 2000. Otherwise, it looks very similar to the 2000 PCI. But definitely will be good to benchmark this and see how the extra megahertz works, and if that improves on the PCI bus. I definitely, even with the bigger heat sinks that these ones have, they still get very warm. So for all video cards from 3DFX, I would recommend an additional fan. Not so much with the VSA 100s, the newer ones, but the Voodoo 3s definitely run hot. So quite a nice card, this one. Quite happy to have one of these in the collection. All right, the next one is the Voodoo 3 3000 16 meg AGP. This is probably the most common of the Voodoo 3s, I would think. It's got TV out, it's running at the higher clock speed. Would have been a very common model that they sold. I've got a couple of these, again, reliable, no issues. It's got TV out, but I've not actually tried that on this card. The 3000 is really sort of probably the most regular one that you would pick up, I would think. So I do have a few of these and was able to get them not particularly expensive. So nice card, this one. All right, so now we're going to get into some slightly more interesting cards. This one here is made by PowerColor. Now, when I bought it, it actually didn't have a heatsink on it. It must have been removed. I've put a heatsink on here just so that I felt comfortable actually turning it on. But I did get all benchmarks running off it. I made sure to have a fan running over it and put some new thermal paste on it. And yeah, quite a nice card, different from the reference design. I'm not a huge fan of the baby brown sort of colour, the vomit colour, but no. But otherwise, yeah, it was a good card, no issues. And I used a sort of donor TNT2 for the heatsink, although the TNT2 still works fine. I will end up replacing that at some point. So yeah, nice card, a bit different. And the next one, this one is quite a rare card. This one is the Voodoo 3 3500. This one was in compact machines. So this actually runs at the 183 megahertz, so the same as the full Voodoo 3 3500 TV from 3DFX, but it uses a normal VGA adapter, which is much more convenient than the stupid 3500 breakout box. But otherwise looks very similar. This is a really nice card. I picked it up off eBay a long time ago, probably a similar time to when Phil's from Phil's Computer Lab got his one. There was quite a few of them listed online, and I picked up one. So quite hard to find these ones. Very happy to have it, and works great. So that'll be good to compare that with the slower speed cards. Then the next one is the regular Voodoo 3 3500 from 3DFX. So this one here, quite different actually, because it has a TV tuner card in it. So that's what that little box is up on the top. So you can actually play TV into it. Again, never tried it. It'll be analog TV, so not useful. But you can see here that it's not a VGA or DVI. It's a special custom connector for the breakout cable. The actual heatsink looks slightly smaller, so I'm assuming this one's very hot compared to the 3000, and I assume that 3DFX binned the chips quite significantly. So yeah, quite an interesting board, quite complicated. I struggled to find where the actual age of it was, but it's actually underneath the PCB bracket, under the VGA bracket at the back. It's actually covering the year of this card. Yeah, look, this one, I would kind of avoid them unless you have a really desire for it. They're just a bit clunky with the breakout board. So yeah, you can see that just under there is where I had the actual age, but I couldn't quite see it. I did pick up a breakout cable separately, so I do have it working, so I had to hook it up to test it, but just big and heavy and puts a lot of strain on the connector on the back. And really not a very useful thing these days. So yes, it is an interesting video card, that one. An interesting choice from 3DFX to release the top model with all of these extra parts. It just seemed a bit of a waste, to be honest. But still, I'm very happy to have that in the collection. And then the final one. Now this one is pretty unique, as if you've watched my videos you would have noticed. This one is one from Anthony, who's built it from the ground up. And this actually has a Voodoo 3 3500 chip on it and a PCX2, which is the often seen in like the Matrox M3D. So you can run both Power GL and Glide, so pretty cool. I've included this one because it has 138 megahertz speed, but on a PCI bus. So this one's used for the AGP versus PCI scaling video components of the benchmarks. All right, so I'm just going to pause it quickly here on the cards so that you can see the different cards that we've got. So you can see on the very right-hand side, we've got a few that run SGRAM. So the Velocity 100, the Voodoo 3 1000, and the Voodoo 3 2000 LC. Everything else uses SDRAM. The Velocity is also interesting in that by default out of the box, it has one of the TMUs disabled. But as you may have known from other videos, that TMU is disabled in the drivers and only impacts Glide and OpenGL. So if you are using the normal drivers and you run 3D Mark or an OpenGL or a 3D Mark or a Direct 3D game, both TMUs are active as normal. And to get it active on Glide, you need to do just a simple registry edit. So that's a good card for us to compare the TMU as between the two. So let's have a look at the system I'm going to be using. Now this one, I'm quite happy with this machine. It took a little bit of time to build it up. The motherboard's a fairly stock standard 440BX Intel chipsets slot 1 motherboard from Gigabyte. But I was able just recently to pick up a Pentium 3 1 gig running at a 100 megahertz frontside bus. Most of the P3s that are 1 gig actually run at a 133 megahertz frontside bus, and that is really overclocking the 440BX. So this wouldn't be quite as fast as a Pentium 3 with a 133 megahertz frontside bus, but it's quite fast enough for these tests. So a really nice little setup. I've got no sound card. I like to try and do my benchmarks without sound cards. Quake 3 has a significant drop in performance if you've got a sound card installed, and I just think it's easier to test if you want to compare your own benchmarks than without sound card. I find a bit easier. 256 meg RAM. I see people often putting a bit more RAM in, and Windows 98 really doesn't need more than 256, and then sometimes you have to patch it. Again, I try and keep my Windows installs very stock standard. I feel like that gives the best representation of performance. So this is just running Windows 98 SE. There's no unofficial service pack. It's just got DirectX on it and the normal official 3dfx drivers. In terms of drivers, I'm using the official 3dfx drivers, which is the last ones for Windows 98, and I'm using DirectX 7A, which I did a bit of Googling, and that seems to be the best bet for the Voodoo 3. All right, on to the benchmarks. Now, the first one I've decided to do is PCI versus AGP. One of the really common things about the Voodoo 3 that people really liked is that you could run them on PCI, so they released PCI versions. You could often get NVIDIA and other cards on PCI, but the performance of the PCI Voodoo 3s was nominally similar, or if not the same as the AGP versions, primarily because they didn't use any advanced AGP features. So I wanted to really see if that was the case, and so let's take a look at some benchmarks. So the first benchmark is Quake 2. I've got a range of benchmarks. I've got Quake 2, Quake 3. I often benchmark slightly later games. There's probably some earlier games that you'd want to test as well. In this case, I've included Quake 2 and Unreal as my sort of older games, and then I've got some newer benchmarks as well. So if we look at 1024, we're looking at almost exactly the same performance. You can see there's an ever so slight improvement in AGP, but very minimal. And the thing that I think is interesting here is even when you're up with the Voodoo 3 3500, so with the 183 megahertz, the performance is the same. Now, if you dropped the resolution down to 640, you might notice more of a difference. But really, on Quake 2, with these cards, it doesn't make sense to run any lower resolution because it's great performance. So in this one, for the Voodoo 3 3500 benchmarks, I used the Lost Joker for the PCI version, and then I used the official 3dfx 3500 TV out, the TV tuner version for the AGP one. For the Voodoo 3 2000, I used the SDRAM version so that it compared the PCI and the AGP one. So yeah, here pretty much I would consider this zero difference. So a good start for the PCI card. All right, we'll jump over to Quake 3, and here you can actually see a little bit of difference. I was kind of actually surprised by the at the 3500, you definitely got a little bit more difference. But this here, I've done it down at 640 by 480 to start with, and so this really means that the video card's not the bottleneck, but it's the the bus and just the throughput. So this sort of makes sense that there is some slight performance improvements here. Again, not significant that you would buy one card over the other one. So, and 3DFX didn't really release a 3500 PCI by itself, so that one's a bit of an outlier anyway from what we were doing. Now let's jump on to the 1024, and this is, we are now very much bottlenecked by the video card, and as you can see here, the performance is identical again. So look, I'd probably at this resolution, we're pushing the cards a bit hard. I would probably drop to 800 by 600, especially if you've got the Voodoo 3 2000. But to be honest, that would have been still playable back in the day, so I'm quite happy with that. Let's jump over to a direct 3D game, and this here is where we get a bit more differences here. Now, everything I've seen with Glide and Direct 3D is that the VRAM and the bus are not heavily used like they are in Direct 3D. There must be a lot more communication back and forward between the computer and the CPU over the PCI and AGP bus when using Direct 3D versus Glide. The Glide's just a much lighter API and not as much complex stuff going on, and so you can see here that AGP actually does make a bit of a difference. Now, the only reason that is occurring is effectively the Voodoo 3s run at AGP 1 times, so it's a 66 megahertz versus 33 megahertz, and there's no other features that the 3DFX card uses. So there is a little bit more speed to communicate back with the system, and that's what we're seeing here. And as you get slightly faster chips, such as the 3500, you can see that there is a bit of a difference there. But again, this is quite minor and not something you're going to notice in day-to-day gameplay. All right, let's jump over to Expendable. Again, this one is a Direct 3D game, and you can see here you're actually getting 4 and a bit frames a second difference up at the 3500 card. Again, I don't think you would notice that in gameplay, but definitely a bit more performance there. So yeah, if you're running like an overclocked 3500, let's say at 200 megahertz, then yeah, you're probably going to want the AGP bus. Then we jump over to Unreal, and this one's a Glide game, and as you can see here, there is just basically no difference. So really the bus is not limited at all when using Glide and PCI. And so many games from the era when they came out, so more around looking at Unreal, Glide was a lot more popular, and there would be very little difference. So overall, for me, the PCI versus AGP bus makes no difference to me. I would be very happy to use a PCI version of the card if I had no AGP bus, or I just had the PCI version of the Voodoo. So great for little small form factor compacts or OEM machines with no AGP, and that's why they were popular. So definitely you're not losing out using the PCI bus with the Voodoo 3. So that's great. All right, over to the next one. Now this one doesn't come up that often, but I thought it would be interesting to include so SDRAM versus SGRAM. Now most 3DFX cards include SDRAM, and that was the common VRAM use of the time, but there were some cards with SGRAM. My understanding was that SGRAM was potentially a little bit cheaper at the lower frequencies, which is why it was used on some of the lower end cards, but when you needed more than 150 megahertz, then SGRAM became expensive or hard to get, and so that's why 3DFX used SDRAM. So it is interesting, there is a slight performance difference between the two. So let's jump over to Quake 2 first. So I'm using the Voodoo 3 2000 PCI, the SGRAM, and the SDRAM version. So this is the 2000 and the 2000 LC. So this is in 2 resolutions, and you can see here that we are getting just over a frame a second extra in the 1280 by 960. So yeah, there is definitely, for otherwise identical cards, there is an ever so slightly bit of performance increase in Quake 2, so that is interesting. Jumping over to Quake 3, again, pretty much no difference here, which is interesting. I actually thought Quake 3 would show more of a difference. With most of the other benchmarks, Quake 3 actually does show differences in like frequencies, but for memory, margin of error with the higher resolution, you do seem to get a slightly difference at the higher resolution, but again, not significant. So that's of interest. Then jumping over to 3D Mark. This one, again, we're only talking 100 3D marks, so not significant, but more of a difference than Quake 3. So that one is, yeah, so there is a slight performance improvement there. Expendable, actually quite a big difference in this game. Don't quite know why. Expendable was quite susceptible to the SGRAM difference, and I did notice there's a couple of benchmarks I did where it did pick up on some differences. So again, we're only talking about a few frames a second here, but that is definitely of interest. Unreal also showed quite a almost 10% difference in performance here, which is quite interesting. So the SGRAM version of the Voodoo 3 2000, it would definitely be my pick if I had the choice, but only certain games it does seem to impact. All right, the 1 versus 2 texture mapping units tests. This one's pretty cool because only one card from 3DFX was released with the TMU disabled, which is the Velocity 100. Really interestingly, there's actually a bug in the 3DFX drivers. They were, in some of their code, they were detecting that a Voodoo 3, they detected that the Voodoo 3 existed by checking that it had 16 mega memory. There's actually a post on the Vogon's forums about someone who's gone and modified the drivers. It's really interesting that based on if the Voodoo 3 with 8 meg wasn't obviously ever planned, and it was added later. And there's some slight driver bugs that were identified. And as I said before, that the TMU is only done in software and only impacts the glide side of the card. So we won't have as many benchmarks, but it's very easy for us to turn on and off the TMUs. So the first benchmark is Quake 2 at 1024, and here you can see a massive improvement in turning that second TMU on. Not double, but almost close to that. So that really means that we're not VRAM limited, we're not memory bandwidth limited, we're not. It's really the texture mapping units that's causing this huge difference in performance. So yeah, if you picked up a Velocity 100 and patched it, you're effectively running a Voodoo 3 2000 for a lot less. I think they were very, very cheap at the time. So I can see why 3DFX limited them in a way, but they definitely did a half-assed job of it. So that one is, massive difference. Let's jump onto Quake 3. Now this one interests me a bit because Quake 3, and we'll start looking at VRAM later, but Quake 3 is very much VRAM limited with the Velocity 100. So what I've done here, you can see when I jump from 640 by 480 to 800 by 600 that the performance drops significantly, and that's a good indicator of a VRAM limit. And so I then switched to 1024 but turned the texture quality down to minimum. And this is what's really interesting. We're running a higher resolution, but obviously lower textures. And with the 2 TMUs, it's actually faster than it was with the higher textures at 800 by 600. So we're not getting the same increase in performance as Quake 2. So I think that's interesting. At the 640 by 480, it's a big increase, but it's not anywhere near what the Quake 2 saw. So there's obviously some other areas of the chip that there is a bottleneck in Quake 3, and it's a lot higher end engine, a lot more complicated to run. But again, look, once you're up to 1024, we are entirely memory bandwidth, entirely VRAM limited at that point. So there's really no benefit to turning on the TMUs. Look, really for this though, for the Velocity 100, I would be sticking to 640 by 480. Anything more is just really pushing it too much. And that's really around the VRAM for this card. Jumping on to Unreal, again, we're seeing this one's almost exactly twice the performance by turning on the TMU. So this one is an absolute no-brainer to turn on and get very good performance out of the Velocity 100 with the TMUs turned on. But with only one, yeah, performance is quite bad. So yeah, I think if you bought the card back then and there wasn't the information online to patch it, yeah, it's definitely not nearly as performant. And 26 frames a second is slow, whereas 53 frames a second is very respectable. So a big difference there. All right, let's look at 8 meg versus 16 meg. So in this instance, I've used the Velocity 100 with 2 TMUs enabled using 8 meg with the SGRAM. And then I've used the Voodoo 3 2000 AGP with the SDRAM. So there is a slight benefit to the Velocity 100 from a SG versus SDRAM perspective, but they're both running at the same 143 megahertz on AGP. So that's why I've picked these two cards. I could have picked the Voodoo 3 1000 and overclocked it to 143. Then they'd both be using SGRAM. So that is an option, but I didn't really want to push that Voodoo 3 1000 with no heatsink on it. And so maybe in future I'll do a benchmark on that. So the first one is Quake 2. So interestingly, at 1024, the 8 meg version is ever so slightly faster. And this is due to that SGRAM being slightly better than the SDRAM. Jumping up to 1280 by 960 though, the 8 meg version just crashes. So clearly not enough VRAM to handle this game at that resolution. To be honest, I probably would play this at 1024 anyway. Under 50 frames, while fine back in the days, yes, if you're big explosions and things, it'll be a bit slow. So in this instance, I'd say for most users, you're not going to have a problem with the 8 meg version in Quake 2. Now, as I alluded to in one of the previous benchmarks, Quake 3 is very VRAM hungry. So you can see at 640 by 480, this is the default benchmark time demo 1 on the Quake 3 demo. So it's not by far the most intensive Quake 3 demo, but this is running 640 at the default setting. So this has got fairly low texture qualities. So you can see here that there's no difference between the two. But if we jump up to 800 by 600, and this is at high, max everything, basically 800 by 600, we have quite a big difference here. And this is purely because of the VRAM. And so having that extra 8 meg really makes a big difference. Again, I wanted to see how that played out when I jumped to the 1024 with low texture details, and this was interesting. I actually almost expected that the 8 meg card wouldn't cope with this. So it seems like Quake 3, it's really where the textures are where the majority of the VRAM usage comes from. And so dropping that down to low texture quality has made the cards identical. So that's quite interesting. And finally, 1024, 768 at max details, we're getting almost double the performance with the extra VRAM. Again, though, while I think interesting, not unlikely to play at that resolution, it's sort of pushing it on the Voodoo 3 anyway. So 800 by 600 is probably where I'd play it. And so if you did have the Velocity, you'd be playing it probably on 640 because 800 by 600 is going to have performance issues. 3D Mark. This one kind of shocked me a bit as to how big a difference it was. 3D Mark just 8 meg for 1024 is just simply not enough. And you see that a bit because Direct 3D is not as efficient. So it wouldn't surprise me if how it stores the textures as well is not as efficient. So yeah, definitely a big letdown here in Direct 3D for 3D Mark on 8 meg VRAM. Jumping over to Unreal, again, I'm pretty sure that all Glide games are just very lightweight and they just run very nicely on any 3DFX card. And so here you can see that there is basically no difference. And again, the 8 meg version is performing slightly better, and that's because of the SGRAM. So in this instance, a really good result for the 8 meg card. And this is at 1024 too. This is not a 640 by 480 test, so quite a high resolution for an 8 meg card. So I think that's a good showing of the Velocity 100. All right, next is frequency scaling. Because we've got so many different benchmarks and so many different cards, we can have a good look at some of the frequency scaling. So Quake 2. This scales pretty nicely with the frequencies, going from 125 megahertz all the way up to 183, and this is in 1024. Now, part of the reason the scaling is so nice is that the memory and core are tied with the same clock speed. So if you increase the core, it also increases the RAM. So it does make sense as to the scaling here. But yeah, very nice scaling on Quake 2. Jumping to Quake 3 though, we are not scaling quite as well. There's still quite clear improvements as we jump up, but you can see here that the difference between 166 and 183 megahertz is less significant. Again, I'd say that that's due to other limitations in the Voodoo 3 that the Quake 3 engine is hitting basically. So there's probably, yeah, to be honest, I'm not actually sure the reason why it's not scaling as well, but it is a heavier engine, and so that doesn't really surprise me that at the higher end of the spectrum it's not scaling as well. Jumping over to 3D Mark, this one scales pretty well. Nice jump between 143 and 166 megahertz, and then sort of it does drop off a little bit at the 183. But yeah, definitely gets some pretty good scaling. The 125, I can see why 3DFX didn't release the 125 megahertz one for the normal Voodoo 3 2000. The 143 megahertz was a really good point. I think they originally, when they released the Voodoo, when they were planning on releasing the Voodoo 3, it was going to run at 125 by default. I think they must have had the chips were performing better than expected, and they had competition from the TNT and TNT2, so they did push it up a bit. But definitely, the 143 megahertz is a good baseline for most cards. But yeah, you definitely do see the performance increase from the higher end cards. Jumping on to Expendable, again, yeah, not as nearly as good scaling as, say, Quake 2. Jumping from 60 frames a second to 75 is not a huge. This is the 125 is 80% of the speed of the higher card, whereas it's quite a lot slower than that based on the megahertz. So yeah, scaling not quite as good here, and that could very well be drivers. Like the Direct 3D was a bit later in 3DFX's era, and the cards were very much set up for Glide, so that does make some sense. Saying that though, I don't actually think the Voodoo 3 is a bad Direct 3D card, other than the 16-bit color and the 256 by 256 pixel texture size. They run well. They are well supported. Unreal, again, the scaling between the 143 and 166 does seem always a little bit overrepresented, but overall, scaling reasonably well, better than Expendable. Not Quake 2 level of scaling, but still quite good. And the final benchmark, I just wanted to see if the Voodoo 3 was really underperforming on a 500 megahertz machine versus a 1 gig P3, just to sort of see, you know, if potentially then I should even be going faster than a 1 gig P3 in future. So if we look at Quake 2, definitely some nice improvements here. Quite a big jump actually, more so than I expected. I suppose it is, the CPU is double the speed, but we are at 1024. So yeah, definitely Quake 2, you want to be running a faster P3 to get the best out of your Voodoo card. So yeah, quite a nice jump there. Quake 3, we're very much video card limited, so no benefit really from going from the Pentium 3 to the Pentium 3 1 gig in Quake 3. So yes, quite surprising really, but just a lot heavier game. Not significant differences going from 3D Mark from 500 to 1 gig. Look, direct 3D games are heavier on CPU, so that does make sense. But I think even overall, really, the direct 3D stuff is limited already, closer down towards that 500 megahertz. So still worth upgrading, but not significant. Expendable is similar. We are getting a nice increase, but not significant. So probably worth the 1 gig in this instance. Unreal, I was kind of surprised by. I thought that it would maybe scale better. Quake 2 scaled really nicely, but again, Unreal's probably, it's not that CPU heavy a game, so it was already getting a pretty good result out of the 500 megahertz CPU. And that is the end of the video. I will post the slides on Vocon's wiki and try and link them below. Yeah, so I hope that was interesting. It's something I've been wanting to do for a while, and really just to look at the different questions that often come up about Voodoo 3s. What I'm planning on doing though is I've already done benchmarking of the Voodoo 3s versus some TNT cards and Voodoo 4 and Voodoo 5. So I'm actually going to continue on this, but with some more different cards. So I'll pick and choose a couple of these. I'm not going to show all 11 cards in the other benchmarks, but I do hope to do a few more videos on the 3DFX cards with some benchmarks. And so that's all for today, guys. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoyed. See ya.